come to part 3, the final video in my 2019 Poland pre-tour series. In this video, I'd like to summarize what I've learned about my great-grandparents Beate and Karl Schulz over the years. Unraveling their story has been a greater challenge for me than Sophie's, in part, I think, due to the many spellings of their last name, which has made the research process trickier. Perhaps the best way to tell Beate and Karl's story is to begin where I started with Sophie's, with their journey to America. Their boat ride to their new home followed Sophie's by a mere 6 months. They departed from Hamburg, Germany, the 26th of April, 1891, on the Hamburg America's SS Gellert, and most likely arrived in New York 12 days later on May 18, 1891. This passenger list, found recently by searching for Schulz instead of Schultz, shows the whole family. Karl, age 29, Beate, age 31, sons William, or Wilhelm, age 4, he was almost 5, Charles, 2 years and 3 months, and August, or Uncle Gus, who was just 3 months, 27 days old. My very first clue in figuring out where they, or at least Karl, had lived before emigrating came in the form of a birth certificate for a child, probably their first in America, born in 1892. Prussia-Silesia, so where the heck is or was that? With the upcoming Prussian head-to-toe tour, I'm about to find out in person. By the way, this is the only documentation I've found for this child. He's disappeared, so I assume died early, not to be seen again. And by the 1900 U.S. Census, their next documented child, my grandfather Paul, born in 1897, shows up, while great-grandma Beate is reported as being the mother of 7 children, with only 4 of them living. So by 1900, she had lost 3 children, including the male child born after the family arrived. As Sophie and her family had, the Schulzes came to settle in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood. They must have worked hard in the intervening years because by 1910, they'd been able to take out a mortgage on the building where they'd been living, 818 West 22nd Street. This is also where my dad and his family lived for the first years of my dad's life. The next milestone in untangling a few Schulz mysteries came when just a few years ago I stumbled on a summary of my great-grandfather Karl's death certificate on Family Search. Here, his last name is spelled Schultz without the C. The spelling had made this historical document hard to find. But despite that, I sure knew that address, 818 West 22nd Street. Of course, it had to be great-grandfather Karl. At that time, Family Search was still sending rolls of microfilm to their local history centers on request, so I was able to order the film, then view and take a photo of the image, and see for myself the names of his parents, Rosie, Noble, and John Schulz. Once some of the satisfaction at finally finding this death certificate had subsided a bit, it occurred to me that Karl's death on June 21, 1922, was followed only 40 days later by the death of William, the oldest Schulz son, on July 31, 1922, at the age of 36. So Beate, by the age of 63, had lost 3 babies and then her husband and son in quick succession. I find the number of Beate's losses significant because I remember my dad saying, perhaps more than once, that he felt his grandmother had babied his father, and in doing so had contributed to many of his father's problems and shortcomings. In today's language, we'd say, my dad considered Beate an enabler. Well, I wasn't around to observe the family dynamics back then. I guess I can at least understand why Beate, having experienced so many losses, may have treated her youngest son, my grandfather Paul, as she did. As best I can tell, Relying on U.S. Census data, sometime between 1930 and 1935, Beate moved in with her son Charles, Uncle Charlie, and his family, and my dad's family moved a few doors down from 818 to 828 West 22nd Street. This might explain why the only pictures we have of Beate were taken when my dad was pretty young. Uncle Charlie's new home at 3712 West 58th Street in Chicago was quite a distance from the old Pilsen neighborhood, so it would have been more difficult for my dad and his sisters to maintain a close connection to their grandmother. I've never seen a picture of great-grandfather Karl or my grandfather's brothers William or August. We do, however, have a few photos of Beate taken, I'm pretty sure, by Uncle Charlie. Like the photos of Sophie in part 2, I believe we would not have even these few if my grandmother Jenny, my dad's mom, had not brought them to our house a long time ago. So here again, as best I'm able for undated photos, I've arranged them chronologically. Here's Beate holding flowers inside the truck's cab around 1925, with my grandparents Paul and Jenny holding the fishing poles in the background. My dad, the littlest, and Charlie's daughter Beatrice and his wife Augusta, my grandma called her Auntie Gusty, and Charles Jr. sitting on the truck. And again, probably around 1925, my dad and one of his cousins between buildings at 818 West 22nd Street with Beate. Here's Beate about 1927, outdoors with Auntie Gusty, Charles Jr., and I bet his sister Beatrice. My grandmother seems to be holding a baby, who is probably my dad's youngest sister Mary Ann, and sitting beside my grandmother with her head turned away would be my dad's sister Louise. And the last picture from about 1930 I call the watermelon picture, with Auntie Gusty, my grandmother Jenny, and Beate standing, and my grandfather Paul, my dad's sister Louise, my dad almost covered with watermelon, and his little sister Mary Ann. About 6 months after my dad left for his World War II Army stint, Beate died. She passed away on June 27, 1943, at the age of 84, at her son Charles' home. In contrast to Karl's death certificate, there's no information about her parents' identity, but Uncle Charlie did seem to think his mother had been born in Breslau, the German name for Wrocław, a destination on my upcoming tour. Finally, besides the simple, everyday misspellings of Beate and Karl's first and last names, I came to realize with greater certainty that their surname had actually morphed from Schulz in the old country to Schultz in the new one. Visiting Forest Lawn Cemetery, formerly Waldheim in Forest Park, Illinois last year, where Karl, Beate, and 2 of their sons and their sons' wives are buried, I saw literally etched in stone Schulz on Karl and Beate's headstones, and Schultz on sons Charles and Williams. William, the oldest, may have led the way in directing the surname transition. In a 1910 Chicago City directory, William arranged for a listing of his name twice as William Schulz and William Schultz, while his father Karl stuck with Schulz. Within days of this cemetery visit, I was surprised to find another unlabeled picture of my dad and his sisters standing right behind their grandfather Karl's gravestone, which is obscured by the greenery. It's right next to Elizabeth Hertig's. With the curiosity common to little kids, there's a good chance one or all of them would have asked why the name on Karl's headstone was spelled without the T. They likely would have known how and why the T had been added to their surname, but sadly, not one of them is available for me to ask. In the last few days, I've also developed another hypothesis as a result of this cemetery visit. That's that Elizabeth Hertig, buried so close to my great-grandfather, with a grave identified by an identical headstone, except for the name and dates, of course, was great-grandmother Beate's younger sister, since I just learned they both shared the maiden name During. That would have made Elizabeth a maternal aunt to my grandfather and his brother, and a great aunt to my dad and his sisters. So, knowing I must use Schulz in searching for my great-grandfather's family prior to his emigration to America has led me to a number of leads requiring further research regarding his siblings, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and the very real possibility of a sibling connection between Elizabeth and Beate has provided me with an important clue in my search for her family of origin as well. Phew! We've reached the end of my pre-tour series. Putting together these video reviews of my great-grandparents' lives has generated a million more questions and ideas for further research. Why did they decide to come to America? The author of the Writing Home synopsis I presented in part 2 suggests this, but I want to know more. Were the pressures and problems besetting the Nadrowskis and their neighbors at that time different from those faced by the Schulzes and their neighbors? What was life like where my great-grandparents lived in their homeland? For example, what did they do for a living, and how were they and their children educated? Where exactly, or as exactly as I can get right now, did they live and worship in what is now Poland? Why did they choose one particular shipping line over another to get to America? Was it easier to buy a ticket for one over the other? They couldn't just purchase a ticket back then using the internet. Were they swayed by word-of-mouth recommendations? Or was one more affordable, and were the accommodations and amenities better on one or the other? Hamburg, America's Gellert, had a saloon. Was it easier to get to one port over the other? And how did they travel to the ports of departure and after arrival from New York or Baltimore to Chicago? By train or some other way? What about the rest of their family members? Siblings, aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, those who stayed behind and those who emigrated. How can I document those relationships, and what happened to those people? I've already begun to gather some of this material, but even with that, I must document the sources and get each translated to make them really useful. These are just a few of the questions that occur to me now. I expect the Prussian head-to-toe tour experience will generate even more questions and ideas. Participating in a very helpful PGSA webinar the other day, I realized just how many great resources are available to me without even getting on a plane. What I do expect the tour will provide, and what I'm looking forward to, is an opportunity, however briefly, to experience firsthand Poland, its history, culture, and the places where my ancestors lived, and to share and learn from the other people I encounter on the tour. I especially look forward to hearing the stories of my fellow tour participants' journeys in fleshing out the outlines of their ancestors' lives. So here I go. Not much time remains before I hop on that plane for the flight to Gdansk. Hope to do more video reporting of the actual trip when I return. Zix mi sesha. Narasha.